Hello, this is the first of a series of videos on the expansion of Russia in East Asia, this one dealing with the period up to the 1840s. I will also briefly mention the Russian foray into the Pacific and North America, which was a natural extension of Russia's East Asia project. Before talking about the history of Russian expansion into East Asia, it will be useful to mention the main geographical features of the region that are relevant to our story up to the early 19th century. First, the main sea mass that the Russians first encountered in the east was the Sea of Okhotsk. This is an extension of the Pacific Ocean that abuts onto the coast of eastern Siberia. To its east is the massive Kamchatka Peninsula, beyond which is the Bering Sea. Beyond that, in turn, lies Alaska, and to the north the Bering Strait, between Alaska and the extreme northeast of Siberia, which leads through to the Arctic Ocean. The Aleutian Island chain marks the southern limit of the Bering Sea. To the southwest of the Sea of Okhotsk is the great island of Sakhalin, and to the south of that the Sea of Japan, the Japanese islands, and Korea. Between the Sea of Okhotsk and the Pacific Ocean proper, there is a long string of small islands called the Kurils, which stretch down from Kamchatka to Japan. West of Sakhalin is the Asian mainland and the basin of the Amur River, which marks the northern extremity of Manchuria. Russian expansion into western Siberia began in the late 16th century and had reached the Pacific coast by 1639 along the Sea of Okhotsk. The Russian presence across this vast but sparsely populated expanse was tiny, but the Russian pioneers and fur traders were determined, and Russian rule followed, with Russian forts and Cossack troops dominating the poorly armed Siberian tribes and killing those who resisted. By the 1640s, Russian pioneers were exploring the Amur River basin in northern Manchuria, and by the 1650s they were building forts along the river. This brought them into contact with the rising power of the Manchus, then busily consolidating their rule over China. The limit of southern Russian expansion into the area had clearly been reached, and in 1689 the Russians signed the Treaty of Nechinsk with the Manchu government, establishing cordial relations and trade between the two empires, and the Russians withdrawing to north of the Amur region. During the early 18th century, the Russians secured their control over northeastern Siberia and the Kamchatka Peninsula, engaging in a number of brutal, almost genocidal campaigns against the native tribes. They also began to explore the islands of the Sea of Okhotsk, notably the large island of Sakhalin, which is a little bigger than the modern Republic of Ireland, close to the mouth of the Amur River, and the chain of the Kurils south of Kamchatka. A Russian expedition in 1739 under Martin Spanberg sought to establish communications with Japan, but under the Tokugawa policy of isolation this was rejected, as was the second expedition in 1742. Meanwhile, Vitus Bering, a Dane in Russian service, sailed around the far north of the Pacific, visiting several islands, his name later being given to the strait that separates the far east of Siberia from Alaska. This pioneering exploration was followed from the 1770s onwards by private Russian expeditions to the Kurils, and later to Unalaska and the Kodiak Islands in the Aleutians, as well as to mainland Alaska. These new Russian settlements prospered, and in 1797 what soon became known as the Russia-America Company was established. Though inspired by the Asian trading companies of other European states, it was largely controlled by Russian government officials, the Russian merchant class being smaller and weaker than those in the West. The company's administrative headquarters was on Sitka Island off the Alaska coast. The Russian Emperor Paul granted the company a statute making it wholly responsible for Russian settlements in America north of 55 degrees north and in the Aleutian and Kuril Islands. It had a monopoly to exploit resources and trade, and was bidden to establish formal relations with Japan. In 1812, a new Russian settlement was established at Fort Ross, about 100 miles north of San Francisco Bay. But in 1824, Alexander I, seeking good relations with the United States, essentially limited Russian claims in North America to Alaska. The settlement at Fort Ross was finally abandoned in 1841, and its buildings and installations sold to an American. Alaska was retained until 1867, when it was sold to the American government. The Russians continued to try to establish contacts with the Japanese. In 1792 they succeeded in bringing some Japanese who had survived shipwreck in Russian waters to Hokkaido, Japanese officials from the shogunal capital of Edo accepting these men, but still insisting that the only regular contacts with foreigners would be via the Dutch outpost at Nagasaki. A further attempt at contact with the Japanese was made in October 1804, when a Russian diplomat, Nikolai Rezanov, reached Nagasaki, but even though he was eventually allowed to meet government officials, his request for regular relations was rejected. From the account so far, we can see that East Asia and the Pacific was not a major area of interest to the Russians at this time. The 1689 border with China was stable, Japan remained isolated, and even the idea of an American empire was not pursued energetically or consistently. Russia's key concerns were in Europe, the Balkans, the Caucasus, and later the Great Kazakh Steppe. East Asia remained a remote area of only marginal interest. Undoubtedly distance played the key role here. The Sea of Okhotsk was some 8,000 kilometers away from Moscow, across often inhospitable terrain, and before the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway in the 1890s, the journey required many months of hard travel. This relative disinterest changed dramatically in the 1840s. Britain's Opium War against China from 1839 to 1842, alerting the Russians to China's vulnerability and suggesting to Russian imperialists opportunities for advantage. I will deal with the period from the 1840s through to the 1870s in the next video. Thank you for listening.